Welcome back for a segment we could title Battle of the Think Tanks, here to argue and defend their views on today's top topics, and I think tax is going to get a big run here. From the McKell Institute and former press secretary to Julia Gillard, Darren Barnett, nice to see you again. From GetUp, Mark Connolly, welcome. And in Melbourne, James Paterson from the Institute of Public Affairs. Again, welcome to you all. Let's start on the tax inquiry today. I'm assuming if you didn't sit there glued to your television set, you have no doubt read about it. Let's start with James Paterson down in Melbourne. James, you have called for closing tax loopholes for what they call the Buffett tax. Warren Buffett, the famed... No?
I think you might be confusing us with our rival in Canberra, the Australia Institute.
I am
terribly
sorry about that.
For.
That wasn't. That was GetUp. Excuse me here.
But the IPA is welcome to call.
I'm going to get to that. James, it was you, of course, of GetUp that was calling for the Buffett tax. Now, Warren Buffett famously came out and said, why should I be paying as much tax as my secretary? Now, this is sort of the theme that's being picked up today. But how realistically, politically is it?
Well, I think it's very realistic. We saw in the US when the Buffett rule was proposed, it was highly popular. In fact, the Wall Street Journal published a survey that showed that 68% of millionaires supported the Buffett rule or something like it. So I think even people who were getting advantage of a lot of tax loopholes couldn't help but support the Buffett rule, because it's a pretty basic principle that people who are making massive amounts of money should pay at least as much as middle incomers.
And so how can anyone argue with it? And it might have been popular, but nothing's happened on it, and it's hardly ever likely
the
to
American
get up.
Senate had a problem with it.
Yeah, I think if we shouldn't set our standards by what the Republican Party in the US does about tax, because I think that's a pretty extreme position. They never want to see anybody pay any more tax ever, particularly the wealthiest Americans. And I don't think that's the Australian attitude. So I think there's much more purchase and possibility for it in Australia.
And James, of course, you take totally the opposite view. You actually think corporate tax should be cut, which I wouldn't think was a popular stance after everything we've heard today, would you?
Perhaps not popular, but backed up by research. I mean, the Department of Treasury put out a discussion paper on tax just a few weeks ago, and they said probably an ideal rate of corporate tax is about 10%. But this discussion about tax actually, it misses a really important point, and that is we shouldn't measure the contribution of a company to this country just by the amount of tax they pay. I mean, it's nice that they pay tax, and that certainly contributes to the services that we enjoy, but particularly when we're talking about the targets of this corporate tax inquiry today, the high-tech companies like Google and Apple and Microsoft, they contribute in far more ways than the tax they pay. These are really high-tech industries. It's wonderful that they're located in Australia. They're investing in Australia. They're employing people. We should be encouraging them to have a bigger presence in Australia and to invest more in Australia, not going after them and labelling them tax cheats, which they're clearly not.
Well, Darren, this is definitely a different view to what we're hearing today.
That may be so, but I think part of the point is that who is paying the 30% corporate tax rate? And part of today's discussion was about 10 companies shifting $31 billion to Singapore in order to cash in on an effective tax rate of 2.5% rather than 30%. So there's a number of companies that are not necessarily breaking the law, but they are using everything at their advantage to try and minimise the tax they pay. That's okay, but do we need to look at the rules, and do the rules need to be tightened so that I think there's a community expectation that companies will pay something close to that 30%. Let's make sure that that occurs.
I think there's two important points here. The first is if corporations aren't paying their share, and if they're not paying, we pay the difference. Right? We pay it either in higher taxes or we pay it in reduced services to health and education. The second is that Australia has had an economy without a recession for 24 years. This is a great economy. This is a great place to do business. Apple is not going to stop selling iPads in Australia if we make them pay a little bit more tax, and Google isn't going to stop doing their ads on local websites if they have to pay a bit more tax. They're here to stay.
James, what do you say to that argument that just making them pay up the same as others isn't going to actually send them offshore?
Well, companies should pay the amount of tax that they're legally required to pay. And it's really important to understand the distinction between tax avoidance and tax evasion, because sometimes they're very unfairly conflated. Tax avoidance is something that everyone engages in. I reckon, Janine, every single viewer of your show tonight has engaged in tax avoidance. If you've claimed a work-related deduction, if you've claimed a self-education expense. No, that is tax avoidance. That is legally minimising the amount of tax you are required to pay.
I'm on your side there on
donation
semantics.
is tax avoidance. And the reason why companies do this actually is sometimes encouraged by government. It is a result of deliberate policy choices governments have made. So one example of so-called tax avoidance is a research and development tax grant that the government gives back to companies who invest in research and development. The government actually encourages companies to avoid tax where they're seen to be doing things which are socially desirable and something we want to see more of.
But there's huge inefficiencies in the tax system in these tax concessions, both for corporations and for individuals. So for superannuation tax concessions, for instance, for individuals, all the tax breaks are going to the top, about 16 billion to the top 10%, when it doesn't make any sense, because we need to be getting those tax breaks to lower and middle income people so that they don't have to go on the pension later in life. Rich people do not need help not to go on the pension. And secondly, with corporate taxes, this profit shifting, this idea that they can shift their money over to tax havens in Luxembourg and in Singapore and in the Cayman Islands, what benefit is Australia getting out of that?
James, what benefit are we getting?
Well, we designed our corporate tax system the way we have for a very good reason, and that is that companies are taxed where the income is generated, where the ideas are. Now, a high-tech company can locate their ideas, their intellectual property, anywhere in the world. They're mobile, their capital is mobile, their ideas are mobile, their people are mobile. What we should be talking about is encouraging them to come to Australia. One of the reasons why they go to Ireland and base their corporate headquarters there and put their tax structures there is because Ireland has a much lower corporate tax rate than Australia. Australia actually has one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. The OECD average corporate tax rate is 25% and Australia's is 30%. And many of our global competitors have even lower corporate tax rates.
But
so if you want Google and Microsoft to base themselves here and invest here, then we should be cutting our corporate tax rate and you'll have much more profits being declared here.
I don't know, I'd be using Ireland as an example after their economy crashed after the GFC, but
that would just accept a race to the bottom, because where does that stop? Then every country does that, and then there's no corporate tax base.
Darren, there is a point though.
We live in a competitive world. The reality is that other countries are going to compete with us, and Australia can choose to opt out of that competition. We can jack up our tax rates, but guess what will happen to investment and jobs and income for Australians? It'll go out.
But I think partly the companies that I mentioned before were resources companies, so they're not going to. I know there are arguments of perhaps using Brazil or going elsewhere in the world, but the resources are still going to be here. So that's one point that's worth making. But this is all about getting the balance right. And what I think is really interesting politically is that compared to 12 months ago, we're now having a debate about some of the hollow logs in the economy. And 12 months ago, I think the community decided that the government's first budget attacked the poor unnecessarily.
Just a tip, this debate over using havens, they might have been tech companies, it might have been Singapore, has been going on for decades. Even government entities, I think the Future Fund uses some tax havens. This is not new. Governments
also,
of all stripes have turned an eye.
I couldn't agree more. And Labor, this is a great populist discussion that Labor will use in opposition when you're in government. Whether you can get away with that sort of campaign, I don't know. But look, I just think it's encouraging that we're talking about these macro issues.
James, what about the issue, though, of resource companies? Because the fact we don't know the name of the companies, I think one company was responsible for 11 billion going to Singapore. Do you think it puts the whole mining tax debate in a different light, given that we heard at that time that it was going to send these companies broke, they were paying so much tax?
Well, resources companies do pay and have been paying extraordinary levels of tax. They are among the companies which have contributed the most
including
to the government's bottom line.
Because there's evidence that companies like Glencore haven't been paying much at all.
Well, I don't know about individual companies, but the mining industry generally has been one of the biggest contributors to the government's bottom line. And one of the problems that the budget is having at the moment is with the fall of iron ore prices and other commodity prices, they're contributing less than they were before. But frankly, we should be celebrating the amount they have contributed already. And they actually go above and beyond almost any other company in Australia because they pay the corporate tax rate that everyone else pays. They pay payroll tax, they pay GST, they pay fringe benefits tax, but they also pay royalties. So these companies have built roads and schools and hospitals across the country, and we should be grateful for that and
And
celebrating
that's
that.
because the resources belong to the Australian people. I think that's an
I
important point
probably
to
shouldn't
make.
have opened up the mining tax debate again. But what about the argument, and it was put over and over again today, and what James has said, that these companies, there has to be a bit of a balance, doesn't there? These companies do contribute, they do employ, and it is a competitive environment. It's not like there is one world tax rate. Everybody has different rates. Why shouldn't we be competitive?
Yeah, well, if you're talking about balance, though, the ATO said $60 billion is going offshore in profit shifting and $5 billion in foregone revenue. When you think about that compared to Joe Hockey's austerity cuts to health, education, it's more than the age pension cut, the New Start cut, and several other cuts combined. Now, I think it's important for people to understand what profit shifting is. It's basically a company lending to itself. So, I mean, if I told the ATO I'm lending $1 million to myself, so I'm $1 million in debt and cried poor, they'd say I was taking the piss. In fact, they'd probably throw handcuffs on me. But major multinational
I don't really think so. They don't get a lot of those. Really.
Well, but major multinational corporations are doing that. They're lending to themselves. We have to strip out these fictions of these 173 subsidiaries, which
They
are
do
all
have to
owned by
take the
same
money
company.
offshore. It's slightly more complicated than a paper transfer. But it's true that. But also, you go back to the quite infamous Kerry Packer appearance at a parliamentary
Yes, we played
inquiry.
it before.
Look, and to
I think
paraphrase,
most Australians agreed with him, didn't they? I think he still made more sense than
there's
anyone
absolutely
today.
there's no question
What a
that
surprise,
people
Jay.
try and minimise their tax. I have no problem with that. It's about the rules and getting people to play by the rules.
Okay, well, here's the final question, because this is the issue. We can have, you say it's great we're having the debate, we can have all the inquiries we want. Certainly the UK is talking about a Google tax, but as we learnt at the G20, you can't do this in isolation. All these moves are global. There's a global structure. We live in a globalised world. Is it realistic for any government to say, oh, this is terrible, we can do something by ourselves?
I think OECD cooperation is essential. And Joe Hockey was right about one thing, which is transparency is key. And we need to work with other countries to have transparency, because we can't even get at the depths of profit shifting unless we have the information. Which is interesting that at the same time Joe Hockey's saying that, he was actually shielding revelations about the biggest corporate tax dodgers in Australia.
James, if you're all about the issue of the competitiveness, if other companies if other countries toughened up, would you then see that we could do that then? Would you accept it then?
Well, unilateral action is very dangerous. I mean, this is a zero-sum game. If we collect more revenue from a multinational corporation based here in Australia, that means they will pay less corporate tax in their home country or other countries, and that will induce those companies to take action too. That's a really dangerous path to go down that could have really serious negative consequences for the global economy. But I have to say, multilateral action is not very realistic to expect either. You said that maybe we shouldn't use Ireland as an example before, but actually Ireland's a wonderful example. One of the reasons why Ireland is having a recovery from their GFC, and one of the most spectacular recoveries in the world, is they have such a competitive international tax rate.
It was a pretty hard road.
I'll let Darren, we're running out of time.
Even the
Bono,
expert
you're
Bono
quoting
agrees
now.
on this.
You're quoting Bono. We have final word. I'll just let Darren say it because we're going to run out of time. Sorry.
I just encourage the debate, and I think it's an interesting thing that we're a long way from where we were 12 months ago, and it's good that we're having the public discussion about it.
Well, there you go. We'll end on that positive note, even if you all don't agree. I have a feeling with white papers as well as Senate inquiries, we'll be having this national conversation for some time yet, and a good thing it is, even if perhaps the money raised won't be as much as we expect. Going to leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you all very much for your time, and that's the end of the show as well. Thank you for your company tonight. Stick around though, because coming up after 9 is the great Paul Murray, PM Live. You will not want to miss that, so see you soon.